This was easily the hardest and most time-consuming step. As I've said before, I'm a beginner when it comes to making dioramas and things like this, but this step took way too much time for me to do, I think. From the amount of footage that I have, it took me 9.5 hours to complete this step. Sure, I could knock off probably an hour for repeatedly watching the tutorials from Real Terrain Hobbies, but that's still like 8.5 hours spent on just a single step. It's a really important and involved step with a lot of stuff to do, but I think my inexperience played a part in it taking that long. For people who do stuff like this, do steps like this normally take other people this long, or am I just, a bit of a slow idiot? Leave a comment on what is the longest it's taken you to complete a single step of a project. I'd love to know how long it's taken you. Following the tutorial, I started with the pillar supports for the roof of the blacksmith shop, cutting the thick balsa wood into pieces to support the upper beams that go around the open sides of the shop, and then gluing them in place with super glue and wood glue. Then I worked on the beams that sit on top of the pillars. I made a small one to span between the two that are close together for the pillars, and then another one to span the full length of the long side of the shop. Using one of the other thick pieces of balsa, I made the beam for the front. Once those were in place, I glued in all the angular accents in the corners between the pillars and the beams, and then I started working on the house a little. I cut and glued all the support beams that go inside to where they're supposed to be. 2 of them are attached to the second floor, and 1 is glued into the bottom floor. I also glued blocks on the inside so the second floor would be held in place and not shift from side to side when trying to put it back on. Once these were all glued on, I swapped back to the shop and started working on the long wall. This is where I decided to make my first deviation from Neil's tutorials. So I cut up some balsa and started gluing it to the outside of the wall. I wanted the outside to stay simple, but I decided to change the inside. Having it be a blacksmith and, having wood right next to a fire doesn't sit that well with me. So instead of making that side wood, I decided to make it stone and plaster instead. Then to finish up the balsa on the shop, I finished that smaller wall on the other side of the chimney. Just cut a few angles, glue the wood onto there, bada bing, bada boom, got it all done. I finished both the inside and the outside with kind of the same design. And this is where I got to in the last video that I made on the fire and hammer box. Now we get to the point where I kind of start taking a few liberties, just a little bit. So I cut up balsa for the front of the blacksmith roof and glued all the pieces on. Then we jump into what I want to call the tedious section of this part, the house. Starting with the second floor, I did the outside edge at the bottom around the whole thing, both sides and the back, and then I started doing the angled sections that would join with the roof and make it look like, a house. After the angled sections were glued on, I had to do a little bit of shaving to get the roof to sit relatively flat instead of it being kind of a little wobbly. Then it was time to work on the roof a little bit, cutting and gluing balsa to the underside at an angle at the top so that way it was held onto the second floor by looking a little bit more natural. I may have to change up a little bit and add a little more to go and kind of hide the tabs that are on there, but this is where I'm at. And once those were done, I was on to doing the corners of the second floor. Using 2 pieces of balsa, I made the corners look kind of like a solid piece. I think it all turned out well and the illusion kind of works, but there are some tiny gaps since I'm apparently really bad at cutting a straight line even with a ruler. Then after that, I grabbed some offcuts that I had and used them to add some accents to the sides of the second floor. Once all the corners and those sides were done, I moved on to the window at the back, using mostly bits and pieces that were kind of offcuts that I may have cut a bit too thin. I made the windowsill, the center divider, and the borders of the window using those offcuts. From there, I started to work on the ground floor, starting with cutting off some tabs used to connect the template that were at the corners so they wouldn't get in my way. Then I began to actually build out the corners of the building. I glued them together before gluing them onto the building because I thought it would be easier that way, and it kind of was. Just using super glue and a little bit of wood glue, they stuck together fairly well, and then putting some wood glue in the corner and just holding it on there worked out pretty well. Once all 4 of those were done, I started to work on the door. Building out the frame was fairly easy, using, a few more of the scrap pieces that I had. Before I started to work on the actual door, I checked the fit of the second floor onto the ground floor and noticed it was a bit wobbly also, and it wasn't fitting together all that nice. So I stopped work on the door and notched out the corners at the back so it would fit in there. Then I finished off the door by cutting a rectangle of balsa, marked it up with a wire brush, then slapped on some glue on the laser cut board and put the door on there and left it to dry. Once it was dry, I cut panel lines in there to make it look like it was an actual door. It was actual like wood beams. And then I marked it up a little bit with my knife to make it a bit more worn and look kind of handmade. When that was all done, cut up a few small bits of balsa and used them as cross beams for the door. After the door was almost done, I moved on to the back of the house. I cut and glued balsa in a simple design onto the back of the house in basically the same configuration as the blacksmith shop's large wall on the outside. Then moving on to the other side of the house that doesn't have the shed, I went for a slightly more complicated but generally simple design. Still following tutorials a little bit. I did, however, place some of the pieces rather poorly and had to remove them, clean them off, and re-glue them on, and cut a few more. Once I had everything glued in place so it looked like it supported the beam in the center of the second floor, I went back to finishing the door. Kinda. I thinned down the crossbars a little bit and cleaned up the top of the door so that it looked like it could, actually open. Once I got the door kind of cleaned up there, I worked on the shed. For the front, I glued the sides on first, and then I glued on thicker pieces to the front of those that hung over towards the opening. Where it connected to the house was fairly easy to do. I just cut the angle, glue them right there onto the shed. The one side was a little difficult because of how tight the fit was in there, but managed to get it in there just barely. Then I made some cross braces for the sides of the shed, and it was done. After the shed was finished, I moved on to the roof. And I know what you're thinking. We're still not done with the front door because, it doesn't really have a handle. That kind of also bugged me when I was following the tutorials of this part. Jumping around a little bit. Maybe next time just, let's just go with one piece at a time and finish it. Just an idea. All right, so for the window on the roof, I cut a piece of balsa and then roughly measured how many I would need to complete that roof area, and then I just cut the rest. Once those were all cut, I spread the glue on, placed them on there, and let it dry. Then I measured a couple of pieces and made pieces that would go on the sides of the roof section, doing just the sides this time. Now, still following tutorials, we go back to the door and we finally finish the door. Cut some balsa at a few different angles and then glue it onto the door as a handle. And once all that's on, it's back to the roof section again. Put a small board on the front to go and finish off that upper section. Then we just make all the pieces that surround the window, make the window sill, and glue everything in. Now it's time to work on the bridge piece between the house and the blacksmith shop. I still want this to be separate from both pieces for now. I might glue part of it to the shop roof before I put on the shingles though. I'm not sure right now. Using the balsa, I covered up the cut tabs, put a bar on the top, bar on the bottom, called it good. Once that was done, I finally started on the final pieces of balsa. I can go back and finish the interior of the roof of the blacksmith shop. It's the same thing as before. Cut the balsa at rough angles that, mostly fit in there. There might be some gaps, just a little bit, but who cares? And then just glue it all up, put them in there, let them dry, trim them a little bit, call it good. And I did make sure a lot of it I did hue before gluing onto this, unlike what I did with the house where I hued it after. Then once I did both sides of the interior support, I mimicked what was on the front side or on the opposite side, and that was all the balsa done. And I'm finally finished with all of the damn balsa. Yes! Yes! Like I said at the beginning of this video, this was the most time-consuming part of this whole project, so far at least, and I'm glad it's finished. Now I can move on to making the stone for the brickwork of the chimney and the flagstone for the interior of the shop. Also start planning out how I want the terrain to be on this board. But before we end the video, we gotta take a look at the finished product so far. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe. Maybe even turn on the notification bell. It really does help me out. But above all else, I hope you have a royal day.